Hello, everyone. The pizza is probably so good. You're probably all talking about how great the pizza is. So thank you for coming today to this panel discussion called Designing Pathways. My name is Naomi Ratty, and I'm here representing two student associations. I'm the president of the Landscape Architecture Student Association, and I also co-founded with Rihanna the Indigenous Design and Planning Student Association this past fall in the Faculty of Architecture. And so to start off our session today, I'd like to read the University of Manitoba's land acknowledgement. So the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect these treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Before going forward, I'd like to also make some acknowledgements to some important key people who helped make this event today possible. So the student leaders from all of the component associations I came to at the beginning of last semester with this idea of having this interdisciplinary panel discussion. It was kind of a wild card, and it was met with enthusiasm and support. And so I'd like to thank all the student leaders from all of the departments for their, again, enthusiasm and support in helping and being supportive and recognizing and putting together this panel. I'd also like to thank Dean Beddoes for his enthusiasm and his financial support in getting this together, and the Partners Program for all of their hard work with advertising and setting up. So thank you very much. And I'd like to talk a bit more about ADIPSA, the computers over there, sorry. So again, the Indigenous Design and Planning Student Association was founded last semester. And at the end of this session, we'd love to have you join our association. So come see Rihanna, or you can raise her hand, or myself at the end, and we'd love to have you attend our next meeting. And our goal is to really, we have a few goals, but for one of the most important ones is to unite Indigenous students across the faculty. When I went through, I didn't know of any other students who identified as Indigenous, and so I think it's important for us to know each other and to work together in establishing and fulfilling what even the university says, and partnering with Indigenous communities in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So again, thank you, and I'll like to introduce these panelists and moderator who I invited, and they agreed so willingly to come. So at the end we have Ryan Gorey. Ryan is an architect with Brooke McElroy in their office here in the Exchange District in downtown Winnipeg. Zoe is a planner with HTFC Planning and Design, and Grant flew in all the way from Vancouver, and he is a project designer at PFS Studio and a landscape architectural intern. And Destiny is an interior designer, and she has her own company called Indigo Arrows. And Chris is a landscape architect and partner at Envision Insight Group in Ottawa. And so with that, I'll pass it off to Chris to begin with moderation.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists for joining us today. And before we get started, I just wanted to get a sense of who is in the audience today. So if you're in the interior design, can you just raise your hands for us? Excellent. And planning? And architecture? And landscape architects? Excellent. Thank you. This is fantastic. We have our community here to join us today. I just wanted to start the roundtable today. I'll tell you a little bit about the format that we're going to use. I'll be facilitating the discussion, but we have some questions that we've pre-prepared, but generally this is going to be a discussion amongst ourselves. We'll talk a little bit about each of the panelists. We'll talk a bit about their work, their experience, and they'll be asking each other questions, and I have some questions for them as well. And we'll just move through a conversation for you today about the topic of Indigenous design and participation as designers with Indigenous communities. So I'm going to ask each of you to first start, just talk if you could just describe us a little bit more about yourselves, your personal connection to Indigenous design, and maybe a little bit about your background to start. And we'll just go across the table, starting with Ryan. Thank you.
Is this thing on? Oh, there we go. Bonjour, Ryan Gorey, Indigenous Kas. Animiki Wikwe Dong and Donji. I'm from Thunder Bay originally, and work for Brooke McElroy. We have offices in Thunder Bay, Toronto, and now here. I guess I began in the Faculty of Fine Arts here at the University of Manitoba, and soon realized that I had to do something else after that. And I think having the cohort of Indigenous designers that we had here at the university at the time, including Destiny and Dave Thomas and Mike Robertson and Aledia, sort of helped me to make a decision to go into architecture, and it was nice to have that kind of support. So it's really really nice to be seeing an Indigenous Design and Planning Student Association being formed here, where those roots were so just early tendrils back in the day. And so I think the question was, what is my connection to Indigenous design? And I guess it's sort of rude. I guess I could provide it as an example. One of my first projects was in Thunder Bay at the waterfront, where I'm from, and being able to have an impact on the city that I grew up in, where I didn't see any presence in terms of my culture. It wasn't part of our lives early on either. There were just snippets, bits and pieces, so that kind of allowed me to start to reclaim not only my identity, but also the idea of the city that I grew up in, and why it did lack that presence. So a lot of our work deals with how does that presence manifest in the urban context with institutions, in consideration of the nations that are within those places. So I guess that's maybe a good start. Which?
So I guess how I came to be doing kind of Indigenous design work, and for the work that I do, it's more designing processes and working within Indigenous processes. When I was in my 20s, I had decided that the academic route wasn't for me, and I was doing a lot of work kind of in community agriculture and learning about plants and herbal medicine, and decided, okay, I'm ready, in like my mid-20s, I'm ready to head back to school, and wanted to study environmental studies, but also being surrounded by really strong Indigenous environmental movements on the West Coast, and seeing that really close connection, I kind of figured that I couldn't really look at land and environmental studies without understanding Indigenous context, and so that's what kind of started me on this path. And so my kind of academic journey was always looking at the interactions between Indigenous people and environment and land, and also how changes in environment uniquely impact Indigenous communities, and that kind of led me to planning, because I was like, here's a kind of legitimate way to make a living doing kind of interesting work in community. And so yeah, the work that I'm doing now here with HTFC, a lot of our work is Indigenous-led, which is, I think, a really great way to be involved in Indigenous processes as a non-Indigenous person and a non-Indigenous planner. And yeah, the kind of design processes are always unfolding, and I'm getting to work with lots of different people from lots of different cultures. So my connection is kind of coming in most times as an outsider, but offering support and kind of filling in capacity gaps where they're still growing. And that's where I'm at.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Grant Fullgrain. I'm a member of Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation in Northern Ontario. I was born in Yellowknife, grew up here in Winnipeg, but now work in Vancouver on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. My journey sort of began a very long time ago. My mom was a survivor of the 60s scoop, so she was taken away from her family and put into a settler family in Northern Ontario, where she didn't have any connection to her culture. And she went through a lot of racism and abuse within that community, and was really taught to not really celebrate her culture or have much of a connection to it. It wasn't until much later on in her life that she was able to start to process those experiences she had, and actually here at the University of Manitoba was able to reconnect to Indigenous communities and started to have opportunities to be exposed to a place where Indigenous culture would be celebrated rather than something she should feel shame for. So what brought me to design is to think about, again, like Ryan was saying, the presence of that in our public spaces and in our daily life, that there isn't an exposure for people that have really been separated from those cultural experiences and from any recognition of their own identity, that it's been an erasure across our cities, across our lands. And so that's something I think that's really critical, that be a larger component of the places and spaces in which we live, not only for Indigenous people to be able to reconnect to that culture and to that land and have that connection, but also for non-Indigenous people to recognize the history of this country and what has happened throughout its course of history. It also provides a platform through design of public space where conversation and dialogue and ongoing engagement of land can occur. So that's really what inspired me to sort of focus on this through a landscape architecture lens and to become an Indigenous designer.
Hello. It's nice to be back here. I have some fond memories and a lot of scary memories, but my name's Destiny. I have, so when how I got into this, my very first project was working on Migizi Agamik, so it's the Indigenous Student Center just across over here. And, you know, it was such a fun project. I ended up getting hired on full-time by the firm. And so my summers were spent working there. And then when I graduated, I was able to, work there full-time. I think the only thing with me, so I started a company called Indigo Arrows, and it's reviving Indigenous pottery and bone tool patterns from Manitoba. So when I worked with prairie architects, I always struggled with trying to find, I guess, imagery, finishes, textiles, things that I could put into projects that really represented the history and the people here on the prairies in a respectful way. There's a lot of textiles you can find on the West Coast that are beautiful, a lot of southwestern patterns in the United States. And but there was just something lacking here. And so I think that was a turning point in my career. So I started learning how to, I guess, revive these patterns that are just existing right now in our museums. And once I was able to do that, everything kind of took on a new path for me. And so where I'm at now, the work that I do after I left Prairie and started creating these textiles and fabrics that I could put into projects, I started taking on a role of a consultant role. So working with First Nation communities, I guess as a design consultant to help them get their ideas into projects. A lot of times they don't feel heard, and they feel like these spaces are getting designed for them and not with them. And so for the past 3 years, I've been working on schools and daycares and offices and things like that with communities as their consultant to help get these ideas across. And it's been quite the journey, and it's lots of great stories, lots of wonderful projects that have been happening. Right now we're working on some schools up north. So I was just flying in little planes, getting to some of these communities is quite scary, but at the same time, like some of these communities you can't get there. You can only get there on a winter road. They're flying communities. Their kids are sent away, past grade 9. They have to move away from their families, and so now a lot of these communities are getting schools where they have a high school now. And just to see, these kinds of things come is really wonderful for me, and I'm happy to be here.
Thanks so much. Each of you have introduced so many topics that I would think we probably have questions for each other we want to explore, but I'm just going to kick it off by talking, sort of picking up, Destiny, on what you talked about, the bringing forward or bringing Indigenous identity and symbols and forms in a design language into projects. I think all of you probably have experience with that, and I'd like you to maybe reflect on how things have been changing in your design career, what you have seen, the changes in bringing forward Indigenous culture into the design process, and then perhaps reflect a little bit on where you think it might be going in the future.
Okay, so I noticed, well, in my experience, I find that the First Nation communities that I've been working with have been taking more of a role in what they want, becoming more vocal. Also, I guess asking more of their design consultants to sit with them and really figure out like what it is, because each community is so different. The land is so different. One school in particular, they want to start showing the history of their trap lines. So their Poplar River First Nation, they just recently got their land protected, a UNESCO heritage site protection, because there was some clear cutting that was going to happen. But they had they were able to produce their own territorial maps, showing how each family had a section in the area. And so we're going to bring those maps into the school. But so these kinds of conversations and discussions wouldn't happen if they didn't demand more and expect more from their design consultants to actually fly up to these communities. I think I've been on projects before where like say for instance housing projects or even like a health center has been designed in like say for instance they just designed here in Winnipeg, and the design consultants really don't fly up and meet with community members. And I think that's where I see a big change happening, where they need to start spending more time within the community, speaking with all of those members and the people that are going to be using that building. And also the site, like how important the site is. So far, yeah, I think that's a big change that I've seen in the last 10 years that I've been, working on some of these projects.
I just want to pick up on what you were saying about, it really needs to start at the upper echelons where advocacy for a process that you're describing, where the connection to community is stronger, instead of just like we've allocated 3 meetings and that's all we're going to give to the community. Having worked on one of the health centers up north and how incredibly rich it was, we presented there, it was a Cree community, and just to hear them speaking in Cree about the project, and I can understand a little bit of Ojibwe, and there's a crossover with the language, but it was just like, I felt like I was part of this special little session where these men were just talking about the site and like the history of the site and what used to be there and things like that. And yeah, having the entire community or a big part of the community there as part of it, and giving, allowing us to advocate for voice within that. And I think that's some of the work that you've been doing, is being an advocate for that type of process, right? Where there's more involvement, where there's more agency.
One of the projects I've been working on that I think can sort of illustrate my process in thinking about this is with the Pacheedaht First Nation, which is on the west coast of Vancouver Island. They had lived on the coast for more than 10,000 years in their big houses lined up along the shore. But through colonialism and through the reserve system, they were forced onto a small peninsula of land that was sort of outwashed from a river system. And it's within an inlet that's called Port San Juan, near Port Renfrew. And it's susceptible to tsunamis because of the form of the land, because of where they're isolated on it. There's a potential that if there's an earthquake, a 15-meter wave could come and wipe out their entire village and community and decimate it. The only connections they have from this little island are to the two shores that they had formerly lived on but were forced off for the development of the villages there. So what they were looking at was they purchased a piece of land that was 200 meters up on a hillside that overlooks their traditional territory, that had ceremonial importance, but didn't have that direct connection to the water that they've always had. So it's a big cultural shift for them to think about this. So the conversations that we were having was really, what does that mean for them to sort of take over that process, and instead of INAC, the Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada, deciding the layout and planning of this with some consultants, is what would they envision from this? How would they see this? So we really informed the design of that from some of the things that existed, but also in the discussions of what was missing from their community today. Colonialism sought to sort of create a separation of people from their land, people from each other, and people from their culture. So it was all about creating these divisions and separations in things. So the heart of the community and the heart of their culture has always been around familial relationships and sort of common practice and common space and resource and common use of resources. So we integrated that thinking into sort of the spatial arrangement, how the spaces would be formed in creating large central community spaces that have their facilities oriented around them, how housing would be arranged around communal spaces, and how it could still reflect some of the traditional forms of housing that would be along the shoreline. So we treated the sort of plateau hillside that they were on as though it was the shore. It was the place that they were a whaling culture, and they would overlook this large body of water and be able to see it. And so we created those as the cultural spaces and really framed it. So we tried to sort of take some of the existing things and also work with them to develop new ways that their community could function, to sort of work through the healing process of reforming those connections that had sort of been affected through colonialism. So that's sort of the approach that we try to take, is think much more about process, or what about is missing from the community, and think about how space can be formed around that to try to bring those things back. And not just as a static forming of space, but how people can actually engage with the land and start to use resources and have it more integrated into their daily life. Because traditional knowledge really formed through the engagement of the land over long periods of time. And the culture has, through the colonial process, been separated from that process where it would continually develop over time. Now it's sort of a bit removed from that. So creating that opportunity again, that the culture is something active and lived rather than something remembered, is really critical in the work that I think we do.
I'll just speak to it as well quickly. Chris, I think you were talking about specifically like, one piece in terms of design language, which again, for me, it's a lot kind of process language. Something that I see, and I'm pretty early on into my career, so I can't say over this time I've seen things shift, but something that I've noticed that I feel is shifting is within planning processes, really celebrating and working towards disruption of systems and disruption of oppressive systems. And I think that's something that's fairly new, recognizing that planning processes are not linear, and specifically when we're working with Indigenous communities, we can't just this is our budget, this is our timeline, we got to stick within it. Of course, as a consultant, there's always a certain amount of that, but I think that
there is a broader recognition now of that we need to be working to disrupt these systems, and that is a big part of planning and of kind of this growing world of social innovation, which is, you know, kind of looking at getting into those deeper systemic changes, and thinking about also, you know, what Ryan had said made me think about where if these are not Indigenous-led processes, but we're working with Indigenous communities, that they must be involved from before day one. You know, I see in a lot of kind of conventional land use planning processes, there's like the duty to consult at the end, or there's kind of a small consultation phase at the, you know, towards when the designs have already been set and when decisions have already been made. And we see that with kind of industry as well. And so in order to actually engage in meaningful consultation, or better yet, kind of consent-based processes, communities must be involved from before when the designs are created and before when you know, all the permits have already been you know, got, and I think that again, a lot of the work that we do is Indigenous led, and that's it's great to participate in that. But when it isn't Indigenous led, I think for those of us who aren't Indigenous, who are there in the room, we need to build that into the process and advocate that it must be part of the process, and create new standards. You know, I've spoken with people before about, you know, we have LEED standards for buildings, and we have these kind of standards of excellence that people kind of aspire to or put on their resume, and I think that we need to be creating standards for consultation as well, that are built into the process, and so therefore it's not like when we're going for RFPs or like having to beg for extra consultation time and money, that it's just the set expectation that this is part of the process, you know, no questions asked.
I want to sort of challenge some of the systems, because I think you've all spoken a bit about the systems, and I'm going to give you some words, and I'd just ask you to maybe reflect on them or comment on them. Indigenous awareness, capacity building, engagement, and indigenize.
You want me to start? Well, the whole concept of indigenization, that's one I picked up on, is really interesting, because people don't know what they're asking when they're asking that of the community or asking that of a design professional. And I think it was a residential school survivor who had, and Dave I think had told me this, that you want me to indigenize you, well then I have to take your children, is the perspective that they brought to it. Like, if you want to absolutely, you know, so you have to be careful what you're asking for. Now it's a little bit uncomfortable, and that's okay. I think, you know, all of us could stand to be a little bit more uncomfortable with the set mindsets that we've been given and that we grew up with. So I think that, you know, the idea of indigenization is a process. It's really about preferencing Indigenous voice in projects. It's about advocating, and it's not just Indigenous people that should be advocating. It's all people should be advocating for the Indigenous voice in projects. So people should just, you know, automatically feel empowered to ask the question, where is the Indigenous consultation? Where is the Indigenous voice? Where are the Indigenous people in this process? Or, and that's just it, you know? So there's my little rant, so to speak.
So I've had similar experiences working on the idea of indigenization and working with clients on this as well. And in particular, Simon Fraser University developed sort of strategic plan to improve their connections with Indigenous communities and do that. And part of that is indigenizing campus, which then raises all these types of questions. But in working through that first process, really it's about building the relationships with the Indigenous communities, not just that project itself, that isn't the indigenization, but it's how that brings the voices into the campus planning, how it builds the landscape framework. And as we begin to have these discussions, it became much more than this one project. It's how would we use this project, which was an Indigenous garden, medicinal garden, and how would that inform the next step that the university would take? How would it make them look again at the things that would be seen from an Indigenous perspective as traditional resources, but for everybody else seen as a forest up on Burnaby Mountain? How would resource use be opened up to those communities? How could something doesn't fundamentally change, but through the process and through the relationship building changes the interpretation of that context that the university is in, and sees it much more as a resource that they can share with the communities that they're trying to partner with. And even through that process is an indigenization. It's just more about the inclusion of Indigenous people in spaces and in places and in processes than it is about sort of the applique of some Indigenous motif across the entire thing. It's how conducive it is to bringing Indigenous people actually into the process or feeling comfortable in those spaces.
I think, yeah, it's interesting, Chris, you're asking about, like, let's kind of think critically about some of these terms, and capacity building and engagement are certainly two terms that I hear and say a lot. And they're also two concepts that can be done in all sorts of different ways. And, you know, for a lot of the work I do, capacity building has to be a part of it. There's some kind of inherent issues with it, it can be done coming into a community, working on capacity building, leaving. But there is also, I think, a really important piece about, again, as a non-Indigenous person, coming from a, predominantly non-Indigenous firm, working with and for Indigenous communities. The hope is that we're kind of working ourselves out of a job, and recognizing that even when there are Indigenous-led projects that we're doing, so, for example, conservation projects, or oftentimes within Manitoba, a lot of it is responding to kind of the ongoing impacts and effects of resource extraction and kind of government intervention ongoing. And yeah, just because a process is Indigenous-led doesn't mean that that the capacity exists in full, and so again, it's kind of filling in the gaps. But just thinking about that engagement piece, oftentimes it can be somewhat uncomfortable and somewhat complex, and sitting for a while, because I think there's a much broader understanding right now of if we're working with land, then it's inherently, we are engaging with Indigenous land, and if we're doing projects, land use planning projects, or landscape architecture, or architecture projects, and we're not looking at it through an Indigenous lens, and working with Indigenous people, that is erasure, and I think that it's kind of a bit of a passive violence when those Indigenous voices aren't centered. But on the other hand, Indigenous communities have been kind of engaged and consulted to death. There's like a lot of fatigue, and there's a lot put on communities for others to kind of do their due diligence. And so it's always a balancing act, and not that I have any answers to this, but it is always something to contemplate, where it's like, yeah, okay, we do need to center Indigenous voices and include Indigenous voices in these processes, but how do we do it in a way that's not kind of putting further burden on communities that are often having a lot to deal with anyways? So, yeah.
I'll just add something quick here. So I've been on different projects where, I've been, asked to be in a proposal as their Indigenous design consultant, just kind of tacked on there, and the approach that I now am able to start saying no to these kinds of things. In the beginning, I was like, oh, I'd love to be on that, but then have a very terrible experience. And now I could, when I do consider being on a project, like I really need to get to know the designer, the architect, like what's happening. But when in the future, when you're working on a project and like again, working with an Indigenous client or community, the process, it can be frustrating because you might come into something where they have been researched, they have explained what it is that they want, and you might be coming in and you're like the 20th person asking them the same question, and they're frustrated, and I've been in very uncomfortable situations where the client has been asked this, but the architect is new to the project. And it's just a matter of having that compassion and understanding and taking the time to be patient when you get to those types of situations. But I'm sure you will, once you graduate, there's going to be a lot of projects coming up. There's so many opportunities coming. So I guess just having that patience and having an open mind too when you do get into those projects.
Just going to say one more quick thing. And again, speaking to those of us who are non-Indigenous planners and designers, to do our due diligence before we're coming into if we're lucky enough to come into those situations where we're working with Indigenous communities, don't show up without doing your homework, I think to kind of reduce what Destiny is talking about, there's a lot of information available, and there's probably information available on the community that you're working with, or you can call ahead of time, to their admin office and say, what are the protocols, or are there any kind of documents I can, learn about before you're coming into that community, again, to reduce that burden, so you're not placing the burden on the community to teach you, to explain to you, for however many time. I think there's a lot of work that we can do before we enter into that community so that we're doing the work to educate ourselves.
An example of that is in Vancouver, the Musqueam have developed a Indigenous design document so that they can give it to consultants and they have it available online so that they can skip some of that process because they've gone through that. They say, this is how our Musqueam symbol can be used and how it can't be used. Here's how these colors should be applied and not applied, and what their symbolism and meaning is, and all their formal things as well, and what their sort of principles are that guide them so that they can have that as a starting point so that the conversations, you skip a lot of that early on process so that you can start the conversations getting a little bit more in depth and building up relationships and having more details and getting down to what is at the fundamental core of what they're looking for in those projects.
I've got two lines of questioning that I really want to pursue. So I'm going to start with symbolism, and I would like to ask each of you to just think about how you, maybe some best practices or some things that you would like the audience to be considering when working with, say, traditional design patterns, language, knowledge systems into your projects. What practices do you follow? How does the type of work you do, whether it's architecture or interior design or landscape or planning, affect the way you think about the use of cultural symbols and cultural identities? And also maybe talk a little bit about technology as well, or the taking traditional symbols and bringing them into new forms.
You want me to start here? Yeah, so I think there's been criticisms of some Indigenous architecture of the past that, they're just using icons like teepees and things like that. But some of those things come from community as well. It's not just designers putting that onto communities. Communities ask for these things, and it's not wrong because our cultures have been disrupted, our design paths have been disrupted. So there's no there's no right or wrong way, I guess you could say. I've done projects where I've designed a building that looks like a turtle, and I've designed projects that are inspired by a narrative of a turtle. So there's things like that. We've incorporated symbology in our projects because that came out of consultation. And like Destiny's work, who's reviving some of these symbols, we're also doing that work, let's say, with the Anishinaabe clan system. The elders that we were involved with wanted to raise that up to not only say that this is how we organize ourselves as Anishinaabe people originally, but also to say to the broader society that each person has a role within that, and that the clan animal associated with that role helps you to understand that you're part of a bigger picture. And you touched on the idea of how language can play, and where a lot of our projects bring the Roman orthography representation of the language, but we're also looking for ways to, through technology, have audible versions of the language, because that's the most important thing. You can't appreciate the nuance of language without hearing it. So there's been a lot of discussion about how technology, how you can enhance a sort of base cultural infrastructure within a project by using apps and building on those things. But it takes, it's a wonderful thing to talk about it, but if you don't have the group within to keep developing and pushing that, they end up falling flat eventually. So we kind of build in some base symbols in a lot of our projects, and also trying to look to let's say, plantings, and how do we bring those to the forefront, because our plant knowledge has fallen off as human beings. So how can we bring some of those things back? So those are a few examples.
I find this a struggle too, working with the clients and trying to move beyond some of the traditional tropes to something more meaningful that really speaks to principles and desires and processes more than it does about symbol on its own. I think there's sometimes a misnomer about the idea of traditional. Traditional isn't something that's fixed in a distant past, but it's something that is more about continuity. The culture's always developed. They always added new things to them. So when somebody says if something's indigenous or not indigenous, and it refers to its authenticity, a group like Tribe Called Red, which is an electronic music group, that's as indigenous as other forms of music, drumming and singing, things like that, because it comes from their indigenous perspective, has aspects of it. So it's not necessarily about the medium in which it's delivered. It's the culture that inspired it, where it comes from, and the people that are creating it. Because in the end, us as indigenous people also get to determine what is part of our cultures. It's something that moves and is shaped over time. And I think, like Ryan was saying, it's all about the disconnection from being able to have control over that. It's really that the sort of the paints and paintbrushes were taken away for so long that now it's coming back to that. And there are new materials, and there's never been an issue for Indigenous people to take in new materials or new construction methods or new knowledge. But what needs to become more robust is the way that that's applied, and the way that within communities it's developed as well, and that there's a familiarity and a comfort, and figure out how you can take something like Tribe Called Red does with their beat machines, and do that with other forms of more contemporary practice and more new construction methods, and incorporating that, including digital design and other things that make them indigenous because of where they come from and sort of what they're rooted in, rather than the focus on the material and some sort of separation from what had been done in the past.
I think just a note, going on language, I've been sitting through a lot of design meetings, and they would put syllabics on the outside of the building, but they didn't consult the community, so they actually spelled something completely different. And just that extra step, like just making sure, if you are going to use that, just trying to find help with that, and then going back to symbols, I've been in situations where you're trying to really push that so that it doesn't have to be so literal. A medicine wheel right here on the floor here, and the 4 colors over there, and because there are communities that the main form of spirituality is Christianity still, and so the moment you introduce something, going back to using the 4 colors, or one community, we started looking at archived photos from the 1930s, and they have community members building teaching lodges, and it's right here in Manitoba, and sweat lodges, and the pictures are beautiful. They're so nice, but they don't want those in the school at all. We were thinking of maybe having some of these in the library, but because Christianity is followed by so many community members, they don't want to scare away families. So that's another thing. Even though yes, they're Indigenous, it doesn't mean you just have to figure out. Again, every community is different, and that's where all the where all the work comes. You gotta research them. You gotta talk with them. Really figure out what it is that is important to that community. But yeah.
There's just one more story I wanted to add on to that I think is talking about story and about projects developing all the time, like architects, landscape architects often, and interior designers, finish the design, and that is the end of it. But I think there's a lot of potential in how these stories evolve, how space evolves over time, how design evolves. So we at PFS had developed a series of stormwater terraces in the center of UBC as sort of a gateway feature. It was a sustainable feature. It had large sort of aquatic plants in it, river grasses and things like that. What the university decided to do was engage the Musqueam and bring one of their artists in to install a welcome pole at that place. So we had created this feature, and they were inserting something into it afterwards. And what they developed was a pole that told a traditional story about the creation of Musqueam, which is centered around a creek, which is the only creek that has continuously been salmon bearing all over Vancouver. So time immemorial, salmon have always run there. Other places they've been forced out. Musqueam itself means people of the river grass. So the introduction of that pole within that feature that we had already created suddenly changed what the meaning of that place was and the story around it. So it was something that evolved over time. It was a reinterpretation of something that we had created that was, award-winning contemporary design, but through the insertion of this thing totally changed the dialogue around it, which I think there's opportunity for that as well. It's not something that needs to be static, but something that is sort of an evolving process and narrative.
Sorry, I just wanted to maybe follow up on that. What I've been hearing you speak about is the process that leads up to the design, and I just wonder if any of you have experienced in a project an unexpected outcome, whether it's positive or negative, but from the time when the design was initiated through to the afterlife of the project, when it begins to become part of a community, have you then learned anything from an outcome that was not anticipated?
I'm just trying to think of let's say the Spirit Garden, for example, in Thunder Bay, and setting the stage for multi-use, and really kind of seeing the life of the place after the fact, that it's embraced both by Indigenous and non-Indigenous people because it exists within the public realm. So you know, seeing uses such as graduations from Indigenous schools, to teachers' colleges holding their orientations there, to theater production companies doing some theater there, to people sending me wedding photos of getting married there, and you know, the structure itself being open enough and, I guess, ambiguous enough in a sense that it allows that kind of multi-use life. That's one example. And to pick up on the ambiguity piece a bit, there's a really good article by Brett McIntyre, who's a Haida architect in Vancouver. Wrote a piece, I think it's called Unknown Ground or something. Unknown, I'll send it to whoever I'll send it to, but it talked about that ambiguity in architecture, in Indigenous architecture. So in some ways it says, yeah, the symbolism does a disservice to the culture because it's trying to paint a simple picture of something that's far more complex. I know I'm going back to the last question, but so before I forgot, I wanted to say that. And I guess seeing the impacts of projects and how they've, like the Spirit Garden, have influenced other communities to consider those types of projects as further acknowledgements of Indigenous presence, let's say, in a way that is very accessible. So I guess that's unexpected, but welcome.
One of the last projects I worked on with Prairie Architects was the Amber Trails School, and we wanted to create some furniture in the lobby space, and that's when I started making these drum stools, and they're wrapped in like a Pendleton blanket. Anyways, we had these stools, but so that community there, there's a lot of Punjabi families and Filipino families in that area, and so on the opening day, someone sent me a bunch of photos, and there was all these grandparents, like Punjabi grandparents, and all sitting on the drum stools, and it was such a cool picture. It was really good, but I thought it was really cute. And so those stools now they're in like 10 schools and 4 universities now, and you know, they're right out there in the public space. And I think what I think, you know, being able to see your culture represented somewhere. So like, for instance, like, you know, even just seeing, say for instance, Canadian Architect or you know, any kind of design magazines, to be able to see your culture in that magazine is very powerful, and I don't really see it very often. So being able to even see your culture in a space and have it kind of like, oh yeah, there it is, you know. So in my home, I have a lot of pillows around and blankets with the patterns, and my daughters are like, oh yeah, that's whatever, that's, you know, our patterns. And so to them it's normal, and that's the kind of thing that, you know, as indigenous people, we don't really, we didn't grow up like that. My parents didn't grow up like that, and so this generation is going to grow up like that and have that pride. I kind of went off topic, sorry.
Maybe we can follow up on that. Let's think to the future. Each of you have come to your profession, probably had a mentor or two that helped drive you to the profession that you sought out. What do we need to be thinking about? How do we have to advocate or change our educational system or our outreach to make Indigenous youth across Canada more aware of each of our professions? What is required to bring more Indigenous people into the design professions?
I think there's a lot of Indigenous youth that are really socially motivated now and have a greater awareness of some of the challenges that they face, and they're seeking outlets for that, and they don't necessarily think of design as something to address those issues that they face within their communities. So much of what I think being focused on is, a lot of the issues of the past and so many of the challenges of the present. But for our people to heal, I think we also need to look forward and have that broader perspective. So I think that's what design planning does, is really look to that future. And I think that's the story that we need to be sharing with Indigenous youth. And I think a place to start is even here on campus. There's already Indigenous communities that are organized here that have, are looking for that outlet. They do an undergraduate program, and they, maybe a general Bachelor of Arts, and they're looking for some way to sort of apply their thinking and sort of the awareness of the challenges, and don't have as great awareness of the design professions of what each do. And I think each have their own strength and address part of the challenge. But if you work in Indigenous communities, you have to realize that it isn't just one field that's able to address all of those challenges. There's a lot of overlap, and they need a lot of different things. Housing is a critical issue in Indigenous communities. Their community amenities, where the shared space that they have is important, but so too is the connection to the land and the processes that are oriented around land. Because right now, most of them are on septic fields and very traditional sort of suburban development type things. And there's other ways that they could relate much more, and that their community could much more reflect them. And I think it takes some of those early examples and people like Douglas Cardinal, who sort of sets an example now. There's a new generation that is coming in that is a broader number of Indigenous designers. It takes those people, I think, to sort of serve as a symbol for those communities, that this is something that's attainable for me. So I think supporting that and pushing the leadership is really important as well in these generations that are coming up, in order to expand it to more Indigenous youth in the future.
I was just going to say, getting the youth involved in your projects is so powerful too. Like, you get amazing feedback, just interacting with youth when you are doing like the design process, having them cut up paper, draw, a lot of the projects, almost all the projects I've been working on lately have a component where we get youth in the community right in there, asking them questions, getting them involved, and even just as at home as a mom, like, all the printmaking that I do, like, my kids are right there getting messy, so I think that's one way that I feel that I try to get them involved and see their importance, especially with designing.
Excuse me. I think that there's a couple different major pieces, as Destiny had touched on before: representation, and for people to be able to see themselves, especially in positions of power within the institution, and positions of leadership, to kind of, those who've carved the way for young people. And I think that on the flip side, we also need to change institutional spaces to make sure that they are welcoming and adapted to Indigenous youth. And speaking of, designing pathways, like creating pathways, and sometimes maybe unconventional pathways into design, and making sure that once if Indigenous youth are able to, navigate their way into the institution, that it's, not only, I think sometimes it can be, what I've heard from when I was a student from Indigenous students in my programs, that sometimes it's actually a really hostile place, and not adapted to Indigenous youth coming into getting those kind of first steps towards their design career. I think there's some interesting questions about what needs to change to make it, to make sure that there's, first of all, access, and also that there's opportunities for ongoing support appropriate for Indigenous students. And I know, just a project that I'm working on right now, which is actually a youth-led project. I'm working in collaboration with Aboriginal Youth Opportunities, and we're looking at, speaking of housing, we're looking at housing solutions for Indigenous youth as they're aging out of the foster care system. And a number of the youth who I'm working with, someone said, oh, like it was always my dream to become an architect. And so, yeah, so looking at where those barriers exist, and figuring out ways to bust through them and how we can all support Indigenous youth in making sure that that they can achieve those dreams, especially where those dreams already exist, to enter into design and planning worlds.
Yeah, and I think building those bridges into high schools and even earlier, sooner. And another, one studio that we were involved with, sort of critiquing here and there was Sean Bailey's studio. I think it was last year, but just going to the community and involving the community and seeing how much that actually affects how the students approach projects is just like, why wasn't this done, sooner? Because they automatically take on those desires that the community have, and you can see it. And whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, they've been given that same base level. They've been given that same exposure, and so there was some really strong projects in there, and the community, having supported the studio as well, saw it was just a really conducive to moving things forward for the community, and the knowledges that were gained within it was really exciting to see. And yeah, I guess the next generation of children coming up, I have a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, and they're the first generation that don't have to question who they are. The first generation that they know they're Anishinaabe people. They know we have our ways of doing things. It's not perfect. They don't have all the language. They don't have all the cultural pieces, but they're reminding me about maintaining those connections. They're saying, well, when are we doing this next? When are we going to this event next? And so they have that desire within them that's embedded. So we as practitioners of culture and language just need to know that there's some base things that we just need to, that we can just keep feeding them and build that confidence within our communities and our youth. So
thank you for that. All of you really well spoken today, and it's hard to believe that an hour has gone by already, but before we go to the Q&A, if you had a message that you came here today hoping to share and we didn't get to it, I'd like to just give you each one last moment to speak to any topic that is top of mind for you.
I was just going to say, one of the schools that I worked on, Fish River School, I remember going to their school, before it was built, going through with, talking about interior design with the students in each classroom, and getting some feedback and getting their ideas, and then going back when the school is finally built, and then seeing some of the things like the ideas that the students had and how we incorporated it into the flooring design, and just seeing how excited they were to walk me down the hallway. Like, I think that was like a really fun memory to think back on, and going to their land-based learning classroom, they had a kick out of showing me a big pot of rabbits' heads, because I'm a city girl. But yeah, it's great to see, when you finally see a project finished and how the students love the space, and yeah, it's just great. That wasn't really a message. I was just sharing a memory.
Mine's probably in a little bit of a different direction. My research, I work with Indigenous communities and write on that quite a bit. The other part of my research really looks at climate change and in particular in the Vancouver context, sea level rise. And I think that there is so much potential for collaborations and building relationships between practitioners of design and Indigenous communities, because those Indigenous communities have thousands of years of knowledge about land and about change and about environment and systems that has incredible potential right now to give us a set of techniques and also methods in the way that they're applied and the way that Indigenous people engage with land that could be hugely beneficial about the coming climate change that we're about to face in terms of adaptation. So my thesis project focused on that, and I've since that have looked at a lot of other relationships that Indigenous people have to land, of ecosystems that have been affected and ways that Indigenous peoples have stewarded those ecosystems, because it's not only about the carbon emissions, but it's also about biodiversity loss that I think is something incredibly important. So I think that should be something that I hope there's a lot of potential for in the future, that while it's a massive challenge that we all face together, is somewhere that we can find common ground and begin to work together, and also a way that non-Indigenous people can sort of see the incredible value that traditional knowledge has, and it's something that can be practiced in the way that we address this, and that for Indigenous people it has a place that the practice of traditional knowledge can really take root, and we can build around that. The other thing is that the cities are all isolated along 200 kilometers from the border, but Indigenous communities are much more broadly distributed. It's a different sort of spatial organization that looks over territory in a very different way that I think is also conducive to sort of changing our mindsets as we look forward, thinking about our country, not just as the city and the territory that's around that, but the broader scale of Canada and the role that Indigenous people can have that bring them back in line with the ability to affect and sort of steward land.
I think, that really speaks to me in thinking about that we have a lot of work to do together, and whether we kind of acknowledge it or not. And for those of us non-Indigenous practitioners, we have a lot of responsibility also, whether we acknowledge it or not. And I think in order to effectively move forward into the future and work on sustaining life on this planet and promoting a culture of health and life promotion, we need to start listening a lot more. I think listening is really key, and when working with Indigenous communities, if you leave time for that space, and it's especially working with elders or with traditional peoples, not jumping right at when it's not like a kind of ping pong conversation always necessarily like it sometimes is, in like kind of Western communities. There's a lot that can come through if you just kind of leave that time and space and just take the time to listen. So I think that those are my kind of two takeaways. I like just listen, and also recognize that systemic oppression is ongoing, and we have a lot of work to do to tackle that in order to do this good work together. Hopefully people feel kind of invigorated to take that on.
I guess 2 points. One is to be gentle with Indigenous people in terms of your preconceived notions. Don't assume that they have the answer that you're looking for in terms of answers about culture, language. We're all in our own place in terms of reclaiming who we are. And, it's often uncomfortable when people come to talk to you and, perceivably know more about you than you do. And so I guess just a word of caution to be gentle, to be kind, to be respectful of people and where they are at. And, as allies or advocates who work with Indigenous communities, assume that let's say the one community that you're working for who have, given you their energy to carry on, assume that it doesn't apply in another community or with another person. You can't uphold that one experience as being the thing that gives you agency with another person, because they don't know you. So you are constantly building relationships. And so I think that touches on, being humble and respectful as you approach working with Indigenous communities and people.
Great. Thank you so much. Again, I know I've personally learned a lot in this past hour, and I know that you've probably sparked so many questions and inspired all these people who are here. So I'd like to open up. We probably have time for 3 questions, maybe 2. So if anyone has maybe if a student has a question that they'd like to ask. No pressure. Yes, at the front here. Brandy's we're just gonna get a mic for you. In the green jacket.
Hi, I'm Megan. I'm studying city planning. This is my first year. I'm Indigenous, so I guess my question is pretty broad. I just wanted to know if you have any suggestions for the Indigenous students here about, I know a lot of people call it walking between 2 worlds. That's often how I feel. It's a very, University of Manitoba doesn't want to call it this way, but it's a hard institution to navigate, especially if you're Indigenous. I sat on the Indigenous Association at the University of Manitoba for 2 consecutive years, and I had to actually take a step back because it's very emotionally draining. It's exhausting having to deal with student advocacy issues of racism here on campus, not only just between students, but also between administration and students. So I just wondered if you had any suggestions, or if you feel that there needs to be something strongly within universities that would help stop this, because I'm very much about bringing youth into universities. I want to see them achieve all the goals that they can think of their head and they want to do. But I also, I have a 7-year-old nephew, and I'm really worried for when he comes to university or what he decides to do with his life. Will he be safe? Will it be a safe space? Will it be respectful? Will he have a podium for him to actually say the things that he feels are concerning? I could go on.
We've got to speak out about these issues. Is that if there's a problem, we have to bring it to the highest level that we can to make sure that we're heard. We can't keep allowing things to happen to us, and if they're not going to hear us, we have to organize amongst ourselves and advocate for ourselves and be a louder voice collectively. Don't feel that you're alone. There's other people on campuses that you can look to. And to try to be more open about some of those challenges that you face with faculty and administrators, because if it's not raised with them, it's really hard for us to keep escalating it to the next level. We have to make sure that we're open and honest about where the shortcomings are. I think this is something that's true within practice as well. So our own firm, I think we're going to go through a process of reflecting on what we're doing. Not to, I'm the only Indigenous designer there. It's not to make me feel safe, but also to when we're going out and working with communities, that we have certain sensitivity and we understand what are the right and wrong approaches to that, or how should we think about it, or even just rethink our process and each take a step to sort of reflect on what we typically do and what would be the best way to move forward with this community. So I think we have to, and I've been trying to be a voice for that within my own firm as I see how things are carried out, and I think we have to try to take that role on as much as possible and just be able to speak honestly about these things and not be afraid of the repercussions. Otherwise, others can sort of suffer in silence too. And I'm sure as soon as you speak up, there are other voices probably that feel in a similar way, and you'll start to make those connections and feel greater strength in knowing that you're not the only one that is experiencing that. And at an institutional level, though, it's really challenging, I understand, and it may not, and I think as Indigenous people, we have to realize that it may not be perfect by the time we get through, but we have to think about those generations that'll follow after us, that we have to think about them too, so we can't be quiet.
I was just going to say, I think for myself, the peer supports was what got me through my master's here. You know, Ryan and Dave, I didn't really know another interior design student who was Indigenous, but I think, like, you know, what I would try and do is also reach out, like, you know, there is now a student organization that's starting up, being able to connect with them, and I think that would be like a critical first step, because there's going to be so many things that you guys are going to share together, and really like help lift each other up when those things happen. Yeah, good luck.
Yeah, and I think that making sure that you have the time for yourselves, you know, there's, you know, universities and institutions ask a lot of people, and it's making sure that you have enough time to be together, you know, with people of like-mindedness, to say no to being stretched beyond your capacity by other people, and to recognize that, you know, there's strength in the collectivity. You know, there's differences in there too, but yeah, personally it was the same for me. Like, I wouldn't have gone down this path without the mentorship, and you know, as well as the support of the Indigenous Student Center here, specifically at the university, and those connections. So, yeah.
I just want to say, you know, for non-Indigenous people in the room, we have to be engaged in conversations that are the uncomfortable truths that Destiny was talking about earlier. We have to be open to being engaged in these conversations and prepared to reflect on our conscious and our unconscious biases. And really, that's our responsibility, all of us who are non-Indigenous in the room, and so that we can make sure that we create that safe and supportive environment and become allies and work towards new relationships.
You know, I really appreciate your question. It's actually made me think of one more thing, was that we're part of organizations within the professions as well. So I'm part of the Reconciliation Advisory Committee within the CSLA, along with Chris here. And that's something that we maybe should think about too, is if that we're somebody that people that are having challenges could talk to, and at least maybe give some advice or advocate for Indigenous students. And this may be something that we should think about, and other organizations within the profession should consider as well, because there's a different power dynamic when it's student within an institution versus a professional coming towards them from another organizational background. And it may be something beneficial that students shouldn't have to necessarily feel like they're on their own, and that mentorship is not just giving advice, but it's also when those sort of tough times happen, maybe other people have to step up to help and have maybe a bigger platform in order to do that.
Great. Do we have any other questions? Everyone's looking at each other. I have a question. I guess it's more of a ask to tell a story from Destiny. You had told a story once about you went to a community and everything was blue. Can you tell? I think that was an interesting story to think about, like when you do a site visit and how it's important for that dialogue to happen.
Yeah, this was when I first was contacted by the chief and council in Fisher River First Nation. My mom and my stepdad actually live there, and so when I was called up there, I went, they said they needed help with the school. It was already designed, but they felt like they needed they needed more help, and so they hired me. So I went up to see them during the summer and treaty days, and the chief, I jumped in his truck, and he said, okay, I'm going to give you a tour of the community, even though I knew the community, but he just wanted to talk about all the new projects that they're working on. You should look up Fisher River First Nation. They're quite progressive. Anyway, so I got to get a tour, and I noticed that a lot of the new buildings, like say for instance the water treatment plant, or like even just like a new, I think they had like a new Head Start building, like all the buildings, the new buildings were a blue metal siding, and it was the same blue color. And so after the fourth building, I said, blue must be very important to your community, because I know like they have a very strong fishing community still. So I thought maybe blue, the water. And he said, no, we hate blue. Like, we hate it. And every time it gets to the point where product is getting delivered to the site, the blue is there. And they were never consulted. And it was too late to return anything. And so I said, okay. So I had the visit, and then I came back to Winnipeg, went to the architecture firm that was doing their building, and then I asked to see their exterior renderings, and the building was all blue. So I just asked them, do you know why did you use blue on the school? And they just said, oh, well, it's a nice color. But they thought it was a nice color. So anyways, I said, well, you're going to have to get rid of the blue, and then when we have a meeting with the community, yeah. So even just that, they were never consulted, even though they're the ones that were initiating all these projects. They just, yeah. So that was a terrible thing.
Thanks. Thanks for obliging me in that story. Great. Well, I know that classes probably have to. We went a little bit over time, so we'll let you guys go. But again, thank you to the panelists again for agreeing to participate in this event. I think, yeah, you've planted some seeds, and it's up to us to do the watering. And so I look forward to the future, maybe having more of these types of discussions. I think we maybe could have listened to you all afternoon. And so, yeah, if anyone would like to come up and chat with anyone, you're welcome to. And so, thank you.